Ethan Miller, a 45-year-old U.S. Army veteran, went into the forest that morning for something ordinary. Rabbit tracks, wild mushrooms, a few quiet hours before winter tightened its grip. But when his German Shepherd Ranger suddenly froze, growled low, then lunged toward an old oak tree, Ethan knew this was no accident. Chained to the trunk, shivering in a torn wedding dress, was a young woman bleeding and terrified. She begged him not to call anyone, whispering that they would come back. As the forest fell silent around them, Ethan realized the danger wasn't behind her. It was already moving toward them. Please support us by subscribing to the channel to follow this emotional journey. Early autumn settled quietly over the Appalachian foothills, the air cool and damp, leaves beginning to yellow, the forest breathing in long, patient silences that felt older than memory itself. The man had learned to move through that silence without disturbing it. At 45, Ethan Hale carried himself with the contained heaviness of someone who had once learned to be loud for a living and had spent the rest of his life learning how not to be. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in a way that hadn't softened with age, his posture still unconsciously squared, as if the world might demand attention at any moment. A close-trimmed beard framed a weathered face marked by hard angles and a thin scar near his jawline, a souvenir from a war most people preferred to remember only in documentaries. His hair, once dark brown, now carried threads of early gray at the temples, and his eyes, steel blue, observant, distant, rarely lingered on anything longer than necessary. Ethan lived alone in a small wooden cabin miles from the nearest paved road, a place he had chosen precisely because no one ever stumbled upon it by accident. The Army had taught him how to survive noise, chaos, commands shouted through radios, crackling with urgency. What it had not taught him was how to live with the quiet afterward. That quiet, heavy, and intimate had followed him home after his discharge, after the explosion that killed 2 men he had trained with, after the night he froze instead of shouting a warning, after the medal he never wore. The only living thing that shared that quiet with him was Ranger, a 7-year-old German Shepherd with a sable coat darkened along the spine and warm amber eyes that missed nothing. Ranger had the steady, disciplined gait of a dog bred for work and trained for loyalty, his muzzle graying slightly now, his movements slower but deliberate. He wore a simple leather collar, no tags, no names. Ethan had once been issued a dog overseas, and when that dog died in his arms after a roadside blast, something in him had shut a door he never expected to open again. Ranger was the quiet exception to that rule, a companion who didn't ask questions and didn't require explanations. That morning, Ethan wasn't hunting for anything ambitious. A small game rifle rested across his shoulder, but the real purpose of the walk was simpler. Mushrooms pushing through damp earth near fallen logs, maybe a rabbit if one crossed his path. The routine mattered. It anchored him to something ordinary, something that reminded him the world still worked in small, predictable ways. They were nearly a mile from the cabin when Ranger stopped, not abruptly, not alarmed, just still. His ears angled forward, nose low to the ground, tail stiff with quiet attention. Ethan followed the line of the dog's gaze and felt the subtle tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with instinct. The forest smelled wrong, not rot or rain or animals, but metal, old iron, blood. Ethan moved carefully, his steps slow, deliberate, making himself visible as he approached the clearing. That was when he saw her. She was slumped against the thick trunk of an oak tree, its bark rough and dark with age, roots twisting out of the soil like knotted veins. Chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles, the metal rusted but not ancient, biting into pale skin bruised and scraped raw. She wore a wedding dress, white once, now stained brown with dirt and streaked with dried blood along the hem. The fabric was torn at the knees, snagged by branches, as if the forest itself had tried and failed to hold her upright. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark brown hair tangled around her face, strands matted with sweat and leaves. Her skin was a warm olive tone, now ashen with exhaustion. A shallow cut split her lower lip, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls that suggested pain carefully controlled rather than ignored. Her eyes, wide and dark, snapped toward Ethan with the wild, sharp fear of someone who had learned the cost of hope. Ranger let out a low whine, stepping forward before Ethan tightened the leash with a firm, quiet command. "It's okay," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, deliberately calm. He kept his hands visible, empty. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her gaze flicked to the rifle, then back to his face. She shook her head weakly, chains rattling with the movement. When she spoke, her voice was barely more than breath, frayed at the edges, but fiercely urgent. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't call anyone. Please." Ethan crouched a few feet away, close enough for her to see his eyes, far enough not to crowd her. He noticed the way she flinched when his shadow shifted, the way her shoulders tensed as if bracing for impact that didn't come. Trauma, he thought, not imagined. Learned. "Who did this to you?" he asked. Her fingers tightened around the chain, as if grounding herself in its weight. She swallowed hard. "If they hear you," she said, her voice cracking, "if they know you're here?" She looked past him, past Ranger, into the trees where the forest thickened and darkened, and for the first time since Ethan had seen her, fear gave way to something colder. Certainty. "They'll come back." The words settled heavily between them, more warning than plea. Ranger growled softly, low in his chest, eyes fixed on the woods. Ethan felt the old awareness rise in him, the one he had never managed to unlearn, the sense that danger didn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it waited, sometimes it listened. And standing there in the quiet forest, with a chained bride trembling at the base of an oak tree, Ethan understood one thing with chilling clarity. She wasn't asking to be rescued. She was telling him he had already stepped into something that hadn't finished unfolding. Ethan did not reach for the chain right away. He stayed where he was, kneeling in the damp leaves, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable, the way medics are taught to move around someone who might break if touched too suddenly. Ranger sat at his left side, a solid, breathing presence, ears still angled toward the trees, but body relaxed enough to signal that, for the moment, no one was charging out of the woods. Ethan pulled a canteen from his pack, unscrewed the cap, and held it out at arm's length. The girl hesitated before accepting it, her hands trembling so badly that water spilled onto the bodice of her torn wedding dress, darkening the fabric in uneven stains. She drank in small, controlled sips, as if afraid that even thirst might betray her if indulged too openly. Up close, Ethan could see how young she really was, late 20s at most, with a narrow face softened by exhaustion, a faint scatter of freckles across her nose, and dark eyes that never fully left his, measuring him, weighing him, deciding how much truth she could afford to give. "My name is Ethan," he said quietly. "I live not far from here." He paused, then added, "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." She swallowed, nodding once. "Emily," she replied, her voice hoarse but steadying now that water had reached her throat. She shifted against the oak, wincing as the chain scraped skin already bruised raw. Ethan noted the marks with a familiar, unpleasant clarity. They weren't random. Whoever had restrained her had known exactly how tight to pull without breaking bone, how to hurt without ending things. That kind of knowledge rarely came from panic. Emily stared at the ground for a moment before speaking again. "There was a ceremony," she said, "music, flowers. 100 people smiling like they were watching something beautiful happen. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. It was supposed to be my wedding. Ethan said nothing. Silence, he had learned, was sometimes the safest space to speak from. It wasn't about love, Emily continued, her words coming faster now, as if once the door opened, it refused to close again. I tried to tell myself it was. I tried to believe that if I stood there long enough, if I smiled in the right places, I would feel what I was supposed to feel. She shook her head, dark hair slipping forward. But it was a contract. That's all it ever was. She told him about the estate perched at the edge of the mountains, all stone terraces and iron gates, close enough to the forest to feel secluded, far enough from town to avoid unwanted attention. The man she was meant to marry came from a family that moved through the world with quiet authority, the kind that didn't raise its voice because it never needed to. Emily described him without venom, which unsettled Ethan more than anger would have. He was tall, meticulously groomed, his features handsome. In a polished, symmetrical way, his manner unfailingly courteous in public. In private, she said, there was always the sense of being observed, assessed, valued for parts of herself she hadn't agreed to sell. When I told them I wouldn't sign, Emily said, her fingers curling tighter around the chain, they told me I was confused, emotional, that I didn't understand what I was walking away from. She lifted her gaze to Ethan then, eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. They weren't talking about money. The forest seemed to lean closer around them. Ranger rose to his feet, hackles lifting slightly, "Pussy," and let out a short, sharp bark toward the narrow trail winding through the trees. Ethan's attention snapped there instantly. He scanned the undergrowth, noting the broken ferns, the faint impression of boots pressed into soft earth. Someone had passed through recently, not running, not hiding, walking like they knew exactly where they were going. Emily followed his gaze and went pale. "They don't panic when they lose track of me," she said softly. "They never have." Ethan felt a slow, cold weight settle in his chest. He thought of the men he had known overseas who could wait for days without moving, who understood that patience was sometimes the most effective weapon. He thought of how often danger arrived not with shouting or gunfire, but with the quiet confidence of people who believed time was on their side. He turned back to Emily. "If I cut you free," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we'll need to move, not toward the road." She nodded immediately. "I know." Before he could reach for the bolt cutters in his pack, Emily spoke again, her voice dropping. "There's something else." Ethan waited. "If I had signed those papers," she said, "I wouldn't have been a wife. I would have been permission." She met his eyes, holding his gaze with a strength that surprised him. "Permission to decide what happens to my body, to my future, to everything I am." The words struck with a familiarity that made Ethan's jaw tighten. He had once signed papers, too, trusting that the people handing them across a table understood the cost better than he did. He had learned, much later, how wrong that assumption could be. Ranger barked again, louder this time, and Ethan heard it then. A faint rustle, the distant snap of a branch somewhere beyond the bend in the trail. Whoever had been here wasn't searching frantically. They were circling, waiting to see which way the prey would run. Ethan rose slowly, every sense alert, and placed a steady hand on Ranger's collar. He looked down at Emily, still chained to the oak, still wearing the remnants of a dress meant for celebration, not captivity. "We don't have much time," he said. Emily's answer was immediate, her voice firm despite the fear threading through it. "Then don't wait for me to fall apart." And in that moment, as the forest held, its breath and unseen eyes watched from somewhere beyond the trees, Ethan understood the truth beneath her warning. Whoever was looking for Emily wasn't worried. They knew she had nowhere safe left to walk toward. Ethan waited until the forest settled again before he moved. The distant rustle that had tightened his shoulders faded into the layered sounds of birds and wind, but he did not mistake that calm for safety. He took the bolt cutters from his pack, the metal worn and dull from years of disuse, and tested their weight in his hands, as if reacquainting himself with an old tool. When he knelt beside Emily, he kept his body angled slightly away from her, giving her space, giving her control over what happened next. "This will make noise," he said quietly. "Not much, but enough." She nodded, jaw set, eyes fixed on the oak as if memorizing its scars. The first cut snapped with a muted crack, iron giving way reluctantly, and Emily flinched despite herself. Ethan cut again, steady and precise, until the chain slackened and slid free from her wrist. He did not rush. He checked the metal, the links too clean beneath the rust, the lock newer than the rest, its edges sharp where it had been filed. Whoever had done this had planned it, replaced parts when they wore down, returned to adjust what needed adjusting. When Emily's ankles were free, she sagged forward, and Ethan caught her by the elbow, careful not to grip too tightly. Ranger pressed in close on her other side, a warm, solid presence that drew a shaky breath from her chest she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan did not point them toward home. He led them away from the clearing, deeper into the trees, choosing ground that swallowed footprints and branches that bent without breaking. As they moved, he scanned the forest floor, his eyes cataloging details the way they always had. Impressions overlapping in the soft earth, boot treads of different sizes, crossing and recrossing, the faint scuff of a heel where someone had paused to listen. More than one person, he thought. And not in a hurry. He felt the old irritation rise, danger made simple by patience. Emily leaned on him as they walked, her steps uneven, the dress catching on underbrush until Ethan tore away the hem without ceremony. She watched him do it, a flicker of something like relief passing across her face. They reached a narrow ravine where water trickled over stones slick with moss, and Ethan stopped long enough to kneel and wash the blood from Emily's calves. His hands were sure, practiced, the movements of someone who had learned how to keep panic from spreading. "We won't go back to my place," he said, more statement than question. "Not yet." She nodded again, then spoke as if answering a question he hadn't asked. "They'll expect that," she said. "They expect everyone to run toward something familiar." It was there, with the ravine's damp breath cooling the air, that Emily told him the rest. She spoke in pieces at first, words chosen carefully, as if each one carried weight she could not afford to drop. Her fiancé's family funded research, she said, the kind that hid behind bed. Philanthropic language and glossy brochures. They called it innovation, advancement, opportunity. She had learned another word for it: control. Her own body had become valuable not because of who she was, but because of what she carried, an uncommon genetic marker discovered years earlier during routine tests, flagged quietly, followed quietly. She had been praised for her resilience, her unique contribution, told she was fortunate to be noticed. When she refused to consent, the conversation shifted. Contracts appeared, advisors smiled. Marriage was presented as a solution, a way to align interests, to make everything ethical. Emily's voice hardened when she said the word. "They didn't need me to love him," she said. "They needed me to sign." Ethan listened without interrupting, his face still, but something in his eyes sharpened. He had heard men justify harm before, heard language bend until it broke, had watched responsibility dissolve in the presence of authority. He thought of how often consent was treated like paperwork rather than choice. Ranger paused suddenly, ears lifting, nose angled into the breeze. Ethan followed his gaze and saw it then, half hidden beneath leaf litter. A scrap of white fabric snagged on a thorn, old now, dirt ground into lace. It was not from Emily's dress. She saw it too, her breath hitching. "I found one like that," she said softly, "weeks ago, before I understood what it meant." They moved again, circling wide, staying off paths that suggested purpose. Ethan chose a stand of hemlocks where the ground rose steeply and the canopy darkened, a place where sound traveled poorly and sightlines collapsed. He set Emily down to rest, checked her pulse, the swelling around her wrists, the way her shoulders hunched as if expecting correction. He handed her food, watched until she ate. "You're not the first," he said finally, the words landing between them with the weight of inevitability. Emily closed her eyes, nodding once. "They don't call it disappearing," she replied. "They call it relocating." As dusk pressed closer, Ethan made a decision he had been avoiding since the clearing. They would not touch the road. They would not seek help that required phones or names or explanations. They would move through the forest the way it demanded, quietly, sideways, patient as weather. Ranger shifted closer to Emily, settling at her feet, a sentry without ceremony. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen watchers waited with the confidence of people who believed time belonged to them. Ethan rose, scanning the darkening lines of the woods, and felt the truth settle fully into place. The chain he had cut was only the visible part. The rest had been fastened long before he ever went looking for mushrooms. Emily was not the first to vanish like this, and she would not be the last if they walked the obvious way out. By the time they circled back toward the cabin, the light had thinned into a pale, uncertain gray, the kind that made every shadow feel deliberate. Ethan chose their route carefully, approaching from the high-rise ridge instead of the creek bed, forcing himself to see his home the way an outsider might. From a distance, the cabin looked unchanged. Weathered pine walls, a shallow porch sagging slightly on one corner, smoke-darkened stone chimney rising like a blunt finger against the trees. That familiarity almost fooled him, almost. Ranger stopped first, nose lifted, body rigid in a way that had nothing to do with animals and everything to do with men. Ethan's hand tightened instinctively around the strap of his pack. Emily, pale and exhausted, read the shift in his posture immediately. She didn't ask what he saw. She had learned, long before the forest, that danger often announced itself through other people's silences. They approached slowly. The front door was closed, but the latch sat at a wrong angle, just enough to catch the eye of someone who had built and repaired it himself. Ethan felt a tight, hollow sensation open beneath his ribs. He moved Emily behind a stand of young birch, low enough that she could crouch without being seen, and signaled Ranger to stay. Then he crossed the yard alone. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cold air and disturbed dust. Nothing had been smashed, no drawers ripped out, no rage, no hurry. The table stood where it always had, 2 chairs tucked in with habitual neatness. But the order had been disturbed in subtle, intentional ways. His footlocker lay open, contents shifted just enough to show someone had looked and chosen. The small shelf by the window stood bare where an old satellite phone had rested for years, rarely used, kept only because the mountains swallowed cell signals whole. The ammo box under the bed had been opened, cartridges counted, then replaced. Ethan stood very still, letting the meaning of it settle. This wasn't theft. It was inventory. Someone had wanted to know exactly how prepared he was, exactly how far he could reach. The forest outside creaked softly as the wind passed through, and for the first time since he'd built the cabin, Ethan understood that the land itself was no longer neutral ground. It had become part of a conversation he hadn't agreed to join. Emily stepped inside behind him, her movements cautious, eyes darting to every corner. Up close in the dim light, she looked smaller, wrapped now in Ethan's spare flannel, the sleeves too long for her narrow arms. Her dark hair had been pulled back clumsily, revealing a bruise along her temple she hadn't mentioned. She took in the room quickly and then laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised both of them. "They don't need to find me in the woods," she said quietly. "They find me wherever I try to stop being reachable." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had spent years believing that distance equaled safety, that isolation could still the echoes of other people's decisions. The Army had taught him how to disappear when necessary, but it had also taught him something else he had tried hard to forget. Avoidance only worked when no one cared enough to follow. He looked at the place he had built with his own hands, the one corner of the world that had felt like his, and felt the weight of that illusion crack. He moved methodically, checking the perimeter, the windows, the back door that opened toward the slope. Outside, Ranger resumed his post, circling the yard with a low, controlled vigilance. The dog's sable coat blended into the dusk, his amber eyes sharp and alert. Ranger had always understood boundaries better than people. Now, even he seemed to recognize that the line between refuge and exposure had shifted. Inside, Emily lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, shoulders slumping as adrenaline drained away. "They're not in a hurry," she said, more observation than fear. "They never are. They wait until you start doubting your own instincts." She looked up at Ethan, her gaze steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That's how they make you come back." Ethan's jaw tightened. He thought of briefings that spoke of pressure without bruises, of compliance without chains. He thought of how often force wasn't applied directly, but arranged carefully around a person until every option felt pre-selected. He realized then that whoever was behind this didn't need to drag Emily out of the forest. They only needed to make her feel that no place, no person, could stay untouched. "We're not running blind anymore," he said at last. His voice carried a quiet certainty that surprised him. He met Emily's eyes and saw something shift there. Not relief exactly, but recognition. She had been alone in this long enough to know the difference between someone panicking and someone choosing. Night pressed in. The forest outside darkened into overlapping silhouettes, no longer a backdrop, but an audience. Ethan extinguished the lantern and left the cabin in shadow, the way he had learned to do overseas when light meant invitation. He packed only what mattered, not because he intended to flee immediately, but because preparedness had become a form of resistance. As they stepped back onto the porch, Emily paused, looking out at the trees that had hidden her and betrayed her in equal measure. "They're not here to grab me," she said softly, the understanding settling fully into her voice now. "They're here to remind me they can." Ethan nodded once. He understood that tactic intimately. Fear wasn't a spike. It was a slow, patient pressure. And standing there, with his cabin compromised and the forest no longer indifferent, he accepted the truth he'd been avoiding since the oak tree. This wasn't a chase. It was a message. And it wasn't meant for Emily alone. They don't need to take her yet. They only need to make her afraid enough to choose the ending they've already written. The phone rang just after midnight, its sound thin and out of place in the cabin's darkness, like a bell meant for another world. Ethan was awake already, sitting at the small table with his hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, Ranger stretched out at his feet, one ear lifted in constant disciplined attention. Emily was lying on the bed near the wall, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes open and unfocused as if sleep were a country she no longer had a visa for. When the vibration echoed again, she flinched, not violently, but with the weary reflex of someone whose body had learned that nothing good followed unanswered calls. She reached for the phone slowly. It was hers, not Ethan's, the screen still cracked from when she had dropped it weeks ago while running through wet grass in borrowed shoes. She looked at the number, then at Ethan. Her face, pale under the weak lantern light, carried no surprise, only confirmation. "It's him," she said quietly, "or someone who speaks for him." Ethan nodded once. He did not tell her to answer or not to. Choice mattered now more than protection. Emily pressed the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was calm, cultivated, almost warm. It belonged to a man named Richard Coleman, though he introduced himself only as counsel for the family. Emily had met him twice before in polished offices where the air smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil. Richard was in his late 50s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with neatly combed silver hair and a face arranged permanently into an expression of patient concern. He dressed the way men did when they wanted to appear harmless: tailored suits in muted colors, soft ties, glasses that suggested scholarship rather than power. His voice never rose, never hardened. It carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades reminding people what they stood to lose. "Emily," he said now, as if greeting her after a pleasant delay. "We've been worried. You left under unfortunate circumstances." She closed her eyes. "You chained me to a tree," she replied, a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "There were misunderstandings," Richard said gently. "Emotions were high. We want to resolve this without damaging anyone's reputation." Ethan listened from the shadows, his jaw tight, recognizing the cadence instantly. He had heard it before in debriefings that explained civilian casualties without naming them, in apologies that never included accountability. Richard spoke of contracts, of commitments, of how easily situations like this could spiral into public narratives no one could control. He mentioned Emily's parents, her education, the opportunities she had been given. Not as threats, never as threats, as reminders. When the call ended, Emily lowered the phone with a steady hand that surprised even her. She let out a slow breath. "He didn't ask where I am," she said. "He doesn't need to." Ethan stood and crossed the room, his movements unhurried. "That wasn't about finding you," he said. "That was about narrowing your choices." She nodded. "It's always been like that." Then, softer, "I've been running my whole life." Later, while Emily slept in restless fragments, Ethan stepped outside with the satellite phone replacement he'd kept hidden in the truck. A redundancy born of habit and mistrust. He walked far enough from the cabin that the trees swallowed the light from the windows and dialed a number he had not used in years. Mark Delaney answered on the second ring. Mark had been Ethan's superior once, a man built like a cinder block, with a shaved head, deep-set eyes, and a voice roughened by years of shouting over engines and gunfire. After the war, Mark had traded uniforms for paperwork, becoming a civilian investigator who specialized in cases that fell through the cracks between agencies. He carried his guilt differently than Ethan did, outwardly, openly, like penance. "You sound like you're calling from the middle of nowhere," Mark said. "I am," Ethan replied, "and I need to ask you something off the record." He explained only what was necessary: a woman, a powerful family, legal pressure disguised as concern. Mark listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, there was a long silence on the line. "That kind of fight doesn't leave bruises," Mark said finally. "It leaves paperwork. And witnesses who suddenly forget." "I know," Ethan said. "I just need to know what happens if she stops running." Mark exhaled. "Then it gets ugly before it gets clean." When Ethan returned to the cabin, dawn was just beginning to thin the darkness. Emily was sitting upright on the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes clearer than they had been since he met her. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in resolve. "They'll keep coming," she said before he could speak. "Not with chains, with letters, with phone calls, with people who smile while they explain why silence is best for everyone." She stood, swaying slightly, and met his gaze. "I don't want to disappear anymore." Ethan felt the weight of that choice settle between them. He thought of how many times he had walked away from things he couldn't fix, believing distance was mercy. He understood now that sometimes leaving was the easier violence. "Then we do this carefully," he said. Emily nodded. "I want to tell the truth." Outside, Ranger rose and stretched, the new day catching the gray at his muzzle. The forest remained quiet, indifferent, but Ethan no longer mistook that quiet for safety. Somewhere beyond the trees, power was arranging itself without raising its voice. And inside the cabin, for the first time, Emily had stopped running toward silence and begun walking toward sound. Emily no longer wants to hide. She wants to speak, even knowing what it may cost. Morning came without bird song. The forest around the cabin stood unnaturally still, as if every creature had learned the value of silence the hard way. Ethan noticed it first while tightening the straps on his boots, the absence pressing against his senses with the same weight he used to feel before an ambush. Ranger stood by the door, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat streaked black along the spine and tawny at the legs, muscles coiled but unmoving, amber eyes fixed on the tree line. He was trained once for patrol work overseas, then retrained by loneliness into a companion. But some instincts never dulled. Emily watched from the window. In the thin daylight her face looked sharper, cheekbones pronounced under skin that had not fully recovered its color. She was 27, slim to the point of fragility. With chestnut brown hair, she had cut herself unevenly during weeks of running. There was still fear in her posture, a guarded tension in how she held her shoulders, but something else had settled beneath it now. An unfamiliar steadiness that did not come from safety, only from decision. They arrived just after 9. No engines crossed the dirt drive, no boots crunched gravel. Instead, a dark sedan stopped beyond the rusted fence that marked the boundary of Ethan's land. 2 figures stepped out and remained where they were, careful not to trespass. Ethan noted the restraint immediately. This was not a rescue. It was a negotiation staged to look like courtesy. The man was not Richard Coleman. This one was younger, early 40s perhaps, tall with an athletic build that suggested private security rather than law. His hair was dark, cut short, his jaw clean-shaven and angular, the face of someone trained to be forgettable. He wore a charcoal coat over a crisp shirt, no tie, the uniform of authority without a badge. Beside him stood a woman in her mid-30s, tall and lean, skin the color of polished bronze, her black hair pulled into a tight knot at the base of her neck. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, missing nothing. She carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. Her name, Ethan would learn later, was Laura Whitman, a family compliance officer, a title that sounded benign enough to hide its teeth. They waited. That, too, was deliberate. Ethan stepped out onto the porch alone. He did not bring his rifle. He did not bring the pistol locked inside the cabin. His hands were empty at his sides, his stance relaxed but immovable, a man who had learned long ago that presence could be louder than force. Ranger followed him halfway down the steps and stopped, sitting at his heel, silent, watchful. "You're on private property," Ethan called out, his voice steady, unraised. The man inclined his head politely. "We know, that's why we stayed here." Laura took a step forward, stopping precisely at the fence line. Up close, she looked like someone who had never wasted a motion in her life. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from constant calculation. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. "We're here to resolve an unfortunate situation." Ethan said nothing. Silence had always unsettled people like this more than anger ever could. Laura continued, opening the folder just enough to show paper inside, contracts, affidavits, signatures that meant nothing without consent and everything without resistance. "Emily is under significant pressure," she said. "What she experienced was regrettable, but escalation will only make it worse for her, for everyone." Behind Ethan, the screen door creaked. He did not turn, but he felt it, the shift in the air, the sound of a decision taking form. Emily stepped onto the porch. She wore borrowed clothes, a flannel shirt too large for her frame, and worn jeans cuffed at the ankle, her bare feet planted on old wood. Her hands shook at her sides, but she did not hide them. She walked past Ethan until she stood beside him, then one step more, placing herself fully in view. Laura's eyes flickered, just once. "This doesn't need to become public," Laura said gently, redirecting her attention. "We can help you, Emily. Medical care, counseling, privacy." Emily drew in a breath that felt like it reached the bottom of her lungs for the first time in years. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but it did not break. "You chained me to a tree," she said. "You called it a misunderstanding." The man beside Laura shifted his weight, discomfort flashing across his face before discipline smoothed it away. Laura closed the folder. "You don't understand who you're up against," she said, the softness thinning. "There are consequences to defiance." Emily nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I've lived with them my whole life." She took another step forward, stopping at the fence line, mirroring their careful distance. "But I'm not your asset. I'm not your problem to manage. And I'm not silent anymore." The words settled into the quiet like stones dropped into still water. For a moment no one spoke. The forest held its breath. Then Laura inclined her head, not in respect, but in calculation. "This isn't over," she said. Emily met her gaze. Her fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. "I know," she replied. The pair turned back toward the sedan and drove away without another word, dust rising briefly before the trees swallowed it whole. Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Emily, expecting collapse, tears, something. Instead, she stood taller than he had ever seen her, shoulders back, eyes clear. "She's not afraid anymore," he realized. Not because the danger was gone, but because the threat had lost its power over her. Emily realizes that the warning meant to frighten her no longer works. Fear no longer guides her choices. The forest exhaled in the early light, a pale gold washing over bark and leaves as if night had never learned how to hold on. Ethan stood by the fence he had finished mending before dawn, the wire pulled taut, the posts squared and steady. Ranger lay at his feet, 7 years old now, sable coat dulled at the muzzle, breathing slow and even. The dog's eyes followed every movement, not with urgency, but with the calm attention of something that finally believed the perimeter was quiet again. Emily had left before sunrise. No dramatics, no promises. Just the soft sound of boots on gravel and the truck's engine fading down the road that cut the forest in two. Ethan hadn't walked her to the edge of the property. He knew when to stand back. He had learned that lesson the hard way, in places where goodbye meant something else entirely. By mid-morning he was at the oak. The tree stood as it always had, wide and unassuming, its roots lifting the earth in slow, patient arcs. Ethan knelt and dug with a small spade until the soil gave way to damp, dark loam. He did not rush. He had never believed in ceremonies that needed witnesses. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the chain inside, the same rusted length he had cut days ago, links still carrying the faint discoloration of blood and rain. He covered it carefully, pressed the soil flat, and set a stone on top. Not a marker, just a weight. Ranger rose and sniffed the ground, then circled once and lay down again, chin on paws. The dog had always understood what mattered, without explanation. Ethan returned to the cabin and put the kettle on. The radio stayed silent. The walls held their familiar scars, old nail holes, the burn mark from a pot left too long on the stove years back. He fixed the loose hinge on the back door, replaced a warped plank on the porch, and swept pine needles into a pile. These were not distractions, they were acknowledgments. The world did not stop because something terrible had passed through it, but it did remember how to be put back together. Near noon, a car appeared at the far end of the drive, not the dark sedan from before. This one was light-colored, dusty, ordinary. Ethan watched from the porch without standing. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, then settled when the engine cut. Emily stepped out alone. She looked different, not healed, not yet, but lighter, as if the gravity that had pulled her inward had finally loosened its grip. Her hair was pulled back into a low tie, chestnut catching the sun. She wore a simple jacket over jeans, her posture straighter, her gaze level. She walked toward the oak first, stopping a few feet away, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I wanted to see it," she said when Ethan joined her. Her voice was steady now, the tremor gone. He nodded. "It's still just a tree." She smiled faintly. "That's the strange part." She stepped closer, touched the bark with her fingertips, then withdrew her hand. "I used to think places held people, that if I stayed quiet enough, small enough, I could disappear into them." She looked back at him. "This one didn't keep me." They stood together without urgency. The forest went on with its business, wind through leaves, a distant bird testing a note. A woman approached from the path, stopping a respectful distance away. She was in her early 50s, average height, with sun-lined skin and iron-gray hair cut short at the jaw. Her clothes were practical, canvas jacket, sturdy boots, and her eyes carried the kind of clarity that came from choosing truth over comfort a long time ago. Her name was Sarah Moore, a county advocate who worked quietly with people who needed witnesses more than heroes. She had driven Emily part of the way and waited while she returned here. "We should go," Sarah said gently. She had a voice that didn't push. Emily nodded, then turned to Ethan. "I'll testify," she said. "I won't embellish. I won't bargain. I'll just say what happened." He met her gaze. "That's enough." She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged him, brief, careful, the way people do when they know gratitude can be heavy. "You didn't save me," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "You didn't turn away," she finished. That was the truth of it. Not rescue, not redemption, presence. They walked back to the car. Sarah opened the door, waited. Emily looked once more at the oak, then at the cabin beyond it. "I don't belong here," she said. "But I'm grateful it didn't ask me to." Ethan watched them leave. He did not wave. Ranger sat beside him, tail thumping once against the dirt. When the road swallowed the sound of the engine, the forest returned to itself. That evening, Ethan cooked a simple meal and ate on the porch as the sky deepened to amber. He thought of all the places he had passed through without leaving a mark, and of the few moments that stayed because someone had refused to look away. He rinsed his plate, hung it to dry, and sat until the first stars appeared. The oak stood in the distance, unburdened, its roots holding nothing that could bind anyone again. He didn't save her. He was simply the man who did not turn away when she needed someone to stay. Some miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. They come quietly, in the moment a human being chooses not to turn away. In this story, no one becomes a hero in the traditional sense. No one is given supernatural power. There is only a veteran, a forest, a tree, and one deeply human choice: to stay when someone needs presence more than rescue. If there is something of God in this story, it is not control or force. It is grace through freedom. God does not chain people. God does not coerce. God opens doors and allows us to choose whether we walk through them. The tree did not hold her. The man did not look away. Sometimes that is how God works in this world, through ordinary people who decide to be there at the right moment. In everyday life, you may never find a bride in chains in the forest, but you may meet someone trapped in silence, a friend who is exhausted, a stranger carrying fear they don't know how to name. The miracle is not fixing their life. The miracle is not ignoring them. Listening, staying, refusing to turn away. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need to be reminded that they are not alone. Leave a comment, whether it's a prayer, an amen, or a simple line about what you felt. And if you believe in stories that heal quietly and honestly, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing these moments of light. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in your home, on your path, and in every moment when you choose compassion over indifference. Amen.